Welcome to the Deep Change podcast, where we explore the future of human potential through psychology, brain tech, and pushing the boundaries of neuroplasticity. I'm your host, James Garrett, and today we have the honor of having Dr. Greg Kelly on the show. Dr. Kelly is a naturopathic doctor and the lead product formulator at Neurohacker Collective. His areas of expertise include nootropics, anti-aging and regenerative health, and the chronobiology of performance and health. He has a broad range of experience, including clinical practice, nutraceutical research and formulation, classroom and online education, medical writing and publication, and corporate wellness. He's the author of the book Shapeshift, was the past editor of the journal Alternative Medicine Review, and has published numerous scientific articles on various aspects of natural medicine and nutrition. But what I love about his work the most is that he's a passionate science communicator and cares deeply about helping the average person understand how our bodies work best. This is a guy who will spend hours in the lab making sure the supplement formulation is just right, and then we'll turn around and spend even more time figuring out how to explain it in simple terms we all can understand. He's thought long and hard about the future of medicine and how we all can live a little longer and a little better. Dr. Kelly, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks. My pleasure to be on. What a great intro. It made me think that I've done a lot of things. So.
No, I'm so glad we have this opportunity. I've been following Neurohacker Collective for some time now, and but really only recently have started using the actual supplements myself, and I've had really positive experiences with them. But for most of our audience, some of them know this word nootropics, and I think that's maybe the best place to start. But from your perspective, what are nootropics and how do they fit into the broader kind of health, wellness, supplementation space?
Sure. So I'll do basically like a quick history of the nootropic space, nootropic in 3 minutes, we'll call it. So the term nootropic was coined by a Romanian researcher. He discovered essentially what are now called racetams, which are, I would think of as almost gray area. They're not really drugs in the sense they're not approved as drugs, and they're not qualified as dietary supplements. So they're one of those things that falls into a regulatory crack. But what he noticed with this first paracetam, that it improved focus, memory, mental clarity, things like that. So what he did is he coined the term nootropic to describe compounds that essentially had positive effects on how the brain worked without negative drawbacks. So we know there's medications like Adderall that can help kids with attention deficit to focus more, but there's trade-offs for that. So the idea of nootropics as originally thought of was it any compound that could push things forward without the trade-offs. And as it turns out, there's all kinds of botanicals, so herbal medicines, nutrients, particularly amino acids that tend to have what we would think of as nootropic qualities that would positively impact some aspect of whether we call it focus, attention, arousal, memory. There's a term executive function that has more to do with how we plan and execute tasks over time. And so what we've found is that individual ingredients have some of these capabilities, but when you stack things together, then you can amplify those effects, essentially spread out into a lot of different areas. So within the idea of the nootropic community emerged this idea of nootropic stacks. So essentially layering multiple ingredients together. And the quality of the product that you've recently tried would be our premier stack, where we've done lots of iterations, lots of testing on individual people to make sure that we are covering a lot of the cognitive bases for performance and not making trade-offs. So that's like the helicopter view of the space.
Yeah, I love, for a lot of, I'm just thinking of parents, for example, who have, a child with ADD or ADHD and are on some sort of chemical, like Adderall or something else. And they do talk to me. They do worry, right? Of course, naturally, about, what are the downsides. And so it's fascinating. I didn't know that there's a sort of, what are the compounds that have upside but very low or very little or even no downside?
Yeah, and the other thing with downsides is sometimes downside's a function of dose. So I would say the single most used nootropic substance in the US, not even close second, would be coffee, things with caffeine. And what caffeine does, it promotes arousal, would be the key functional benefit. But when we have better arousal, that allows us to have more focused attention. But if we do too much caffeine, then what happens is we still get that arousal, but we get too much of it, so we start making mistakes. We get confident to the point of overconfident. So what we see with most things, I mean, imagine like an upside down U. So at lower doses, we start to climb up, to where the top would be peak performance. But if we take too much of it, we start to slide down the other end. And I know personally, one of my first experiences with a lot of coffee was, so my background before all the great things that you mentioned was I was an officer in the Navy. And one of my first experiences with coffee was I had watched from 4 till 8 in the morning and then had to take an exam for the Navy at 8. So I drank a lot of coffee that night. And when I went to write my exam, my hand was trembling. I'd gone too far into the arousal, and my test score wasn't ideal either. So coffee has a sweet spot for cognitive performance. Caffeine usually, for most people, somewhere between 50 to say 200, 250 milligrams gets us to that peak. Less than that, too much, we start to not maximize the potential of coffee. So what I think of is there's certain things that have, by their nature, more of a trade-off, but even things that have a limited trade-off, often it's the dose that we need to optimize, almost like exercise.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, it reminds me, in psychology, there's this curve, the upside down U with stress, called the Yerkes-Dodson.
Exactly, yeah.
Curve. And that peak performance, you need a little bit of kind of arousal to kind of zero, focus basically telling your brain there's something really important to pay attention to, right? Yeah. But too much, those declines hit pretty hard. Fascinating. So tell us, you mentioned these different areas of cognition. You mentioned executive function, memory. Tell us the kind of areas that you guys see as the ones you're trying to target, and why you're trying to target all of them at the same time.
Okay. Yeah. So there's really, neuroscientists would think in terms of there being 6 cognitive domains. So these are the big bucket areas. So one would be attention. Usually they'll say complex attention. One is visual motor skills. Another is memory. A fourth would be executive function. And the last 2, one is all our language capabilities. And the 6th is what I would think of as social cognition. And so those are the 6 main buckets. And typically, nootropics do the best in those first 4. So attention, memory, executive function, and visual motor processing. And visual motor, we would see things in that, like seeing a visual stimuli and reaction time. So something that would be super important as an example for a baseball player. Or most athletes. So those are the main areas we focused on. We're starting now to do a bit in the what I would call the social bucket, to see if we can create eventually what my working project name is, an empathy stack. But I mean, there are compounds that seem to make people a bit more altruistic, a bit more prone to see happy faces in the environment as opposed to non-happy faces. And so, to us, that's an interesting project that we're starting to work on. But our original stack was geared to really get attention. Attention's the foundation, just like coffee with that arousal piece. Yeah, that's the core thing. Without that, like if you're sleepy, the other stuff's not going to work well. So you'll see caffeine in some form in almost all nootropic stacks. And then once you start to think in terms of visual motor skills, then that's where that accuracy piece comes in. Coffee will do a bit on its own, but it's got a narrow window where it works best. But when you stack it with this compound called theanine, or theanine, sometimes it's called, from green tea, that actually helps to give what's often described as a relaxed calm. So it balances out coffee, right? It's now starts to spread your capacities into other areas that coffee alone doesn't do so great. And then eggs are a great source of this nutrient called choline. The Institute of Medicine thinks roughly 4 out of 5 American adults don't get enough of it in their diet. And choline's super important for something you mentioned before we went live, which is acetylcholine, one of our big neurotransmitter pathways, and super involved in what I think of as the memory, the learning pieces. That and dopamine kind of both work in that. And so when you start to say, like, how do we want to induce better performance across these domains, it starts building stack upon stack. So you'd have a choline or acetylcholine stack. You'd have a dopamine stack. You'd have your arousal stack. You'd have your, calm attention, calm focused stack built around theanine. And so when we, designed Qualia, that's how we designed it, like mini stacks upon mini stacks. And then the latter part is, if you just went super high with caffeine, that's going to give you your most subjective immediate response. You take 300, 400 milligrams of caffeine, most people are going to feel it.
Notice it, yeah.
Right. And so what you see sometimes with nootropic formulations is they'll do a lot to make people feel something right now, but not so much to improve things slowly over time. And that's where the neuroplasticity, things like brain-derived nootropic factor, things that boost better learning, memory, the terms are like long-term potentiation, but they're all the biochemistry our brain needs to actually make it so it can remember and then pull out memories better. So when we design to make sure we give a good immediate, but not at the trade-off of anything long-term, and then build in a long-term stack as part of that. So that's the big picture.
I want to get into neuroplasticity, but I do want to ask this question because I've noticed that with Qualia, mind, because you have mind and focus, which are 2 different formulations of Qualia, but within mind, you have a caffeine-free and one that does have caffeine. With the caffeine-free, are there other elements that are kind of acting as that stimulant or arousal piece?
No, not in our caffeine-free. We don't. Really. There's nothing that's going to quite work like that. You can kind of indirectly get there with things that, for lack of a better word, that would have a similar effect. But the idea behind that caffeine-free was a stimulant-free version, because the people that wanted no caffeine really wanted no stimulant. So we made it for a relatively narrow audience. And the truth is, quite a few people that actually take it with coffee. They just wanted to be able to more directly control their caffeine intake.
Interesting. Well, and you can also see, one of the biggest reasons we do feel tired, of course, is really lack of sleep or poor sleep. And so if you're dialing in those sleep routines and making sure you're not looking at your phone for 90 minutes before you go to bed and, all the sleep hygiene stuff, you can see arousal not being as needed, maybe, right?
Sure. I mean, we think of, in my intro, you mentioned chronobiology or performance. So basically that's just a sciencey way to say that we really care about how the body function changes over the course of the day and night. So circadian rhythms would be the more, I guess, description of that, but also body clock function. So caffeine early in the day is fairly neutral on our body clock, especially when we're habituated to taking it. But I take all of my Qualia and my coffee usually between about 6:30 and 9 in the morning. And that's a fairly safe time to not disrupt sleep at night. Now, if you took crazy high doses of caffeine in the morning, it could still, for sensitive people, still bleed into the night. But now if you shift coffee, like for me, I would think of myself as relatively sensitive to coffee. So I can have coffee anytime pretty much before noon with no impact on my sleep. But even coffee ice cream or coffee yogurt at 8 at night is going to disrupt my sleep. And the way it plays out for me is I'll typically have no problem falling asleep, but I'll wake up much earlier than I normally need to. So instead of waking up at, say, 6:30, I'll be wide awake at 4. So that's a great hack
the following day.
Yeah. So I can get to sleep fine with a low amount at night, but it essentially drags my body clock to wake earlier. And so that happens a lot with coffee at night. It shifts the timing of the body clock as well as disrupting ability to get into deep sleep. So for me, like I front load caffeine, coffee early in my day, and then I'm essentially caffeine free from mid-morning till I go to bed.
Got it. Yeah, I want to get back to timing as well, because I know this is one of your specialties, but let's dive into neuroplasticity, because you mentioned acetylcholine is one of these really interesting things for me in my own reading about the kids, for example, are pulsing or just, in their brains, they naturally produce tons of acetylcholine. And of course, as we get older, that slowly starts to diminish. Mm-hmm. And so one of the intriguing things I think about accelerating or kind of helping your brain do what it naturally does, right? Which is to produce this capacity to rewire itself. Another way of saying that is just to learn. That's what learning means. So what are, you mentioned again, the eggs and things, but what other elements of the stacks that you've built with Qualia are sort of also contributing to neuroplasticity?
Okay, so if you don't mind, I'll get a little bit nerdy, but we'll go back to acetylcholine. So when I think of a neurotransmitter, there's a couple different big pieces. So we want to be able to build it. And the key thing for that is the substrate. So in this case, getting more choline that can actually get into the brain. So there's two great forms of that, alpha GPC and citicoline, are the dietary supplement names. So the advantage of those is there's modest doses can get to the brain and start to have an impact. The next thing after we build the molecule is we would store it. This is in basically the space between neurons, the synapse they called it. That's where the neurotransmitter is released into. So we store it, and then once we release it, that's what I think of as the signaling piece, right? Mm-hmm. So that signal then tells the other neurons nearby what to do. So we want to be able to do good bursts of it. And what allows that is cleanup. So once we release it, most of these things just float in that synaptical cleft for a really tiny, tiny amount of time. And then they're almost cleaned up, recycled, and then rebuilt into acetylcholine. So what we want to do is we want to start from the building block, support the enzymes that make it into something that can be stored. And as it turns out, some of the herbal compounds, like bacopa is an example. Ginseng would be another one. They tend to support the making of acetylcholine from these building block compounds you'd get in eggs, as an example. And then other nutrients tend to work on making the receptors respond better. So part of the signaling part, and then still others help the cleanup and recycling. So when I think of acetylcholine stack, it should do something for all of those areas. And each element that it's helping the entire process. Right. So when we think of we would often will call it full pathway support. But that would be the complex systems approach. Let's look from the beginning to the end of how that molecule, neurotransmitter, in this case, acetylcholine, is used, and make sure we're supporting the flow through the entire system. And at this sort of systems thinking, I know that you and some of the other founders of Neurohacker Collective are pretty keen on this, because and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like it's one of the things that really you guys try to differentiate yourselves from others. Tell us more about how you guys think about things as a system in the brain. Sure. So one of our founders, Daniel Smachtenberger, he came out of a complex science systems think tank. So that's his background. Yeah. And really, just for the audience, a bird's eye view of complexity science is it's really the difference between thinking of an ant and an ant colony, as an example, right? So an ant walking on my desk right now wouldn't be particularly smart. It wouldn't be able to solve many problems. But if you put an ant colony somewhere in the Neurohacker Collective, say, landscape somewhere, that thing's smart as can be, right? It's going to adapt to all kinds of real world problems, super tough to get rid of, right? So that's called a superorganism in complexity science, because each ant is in a sense like a computer node in the internet, right? It's a one node in a complex adaptive network of things. So the key thing with complexity science is this idea that things learn and adapt. They essentially change the rules of the game as the game is played. That's why it's so hard to get rid of things like, bees, ants. It's also the reason why cancer is tough to overcome, and why it's hard to lose weight, because the network of body fat cells is a complex adaptive system, right? It's a system within our body, but it's a system that's interrelated, right? There's no single fat cell that's, that you can say this one's in charge, but that network of fat cells adapts in really challenging ways to overcome. Cancer is the same. So one of the advantages of combating cancer that medicines move towards is realizing that our immune system's also a network, and that it's also a complex adaptive system. So improving that on its own can help a lot with cancer. So that's the idea of biologics that's advanced with a lot of the new cancer drugs, is rather than trying to just kill and poison cancer cells, which is, trying to get rid of individual ants, teaching our immune system to do better at getting rid of them works better. And then the brain is one of the most advanced pieces of networked things that we have, right? Because all these neurons are interconnected. So, there's really no single neuron that's in charge of anything. It's the units and the interactions between them is what gives us our consciousness and our ability to learn and remember. So I would say the key thing when I think of complexity science that I'd like your audience to take away is this idea, and I call it the life finds a way. So did you ever read the book Jurassic Park or see the original movie?
Yeah, I saw the original movie, yeah.
Okay, so there's this chaos theory scientist, Dr. Malcolm is his name, Jeff Goldberg, but that actor plays him, right? And so he's brought into this, essentially dinosaur zoo, and a bunch of the InGen is the name of the people that created the dinosaurs. And they're like, we got it all covered. It's all under control. We've manipulated their DNA, And he comes in, he's like, this is a disaster waiting to happen. And so they're essentially looking at the same information, but the complexity science, which chaos theory is a subset of complex system science, was seeing that, life is going to find a way. We're talking about an ant colony here, not a single ant. These things are going to behave in ways we can't predict. Right. And what you can predict is life's going to find a way. It's going to adapt, learn, evolve. And so when we think of supporting the brain with nootropics, we're always thinking in terms of, if we do this, how's the system going to learn? How's it going to adapt? As opposed to just doing this and expecting that if we do high amounts of this, we're going to get this effect. We figure we're going to get this effect and then some long-term effect. And so one of the core things in both our testing and our recommendations for users is this idea of cycling nootropics. So our base recommendation is you take Qualia for 5 days, take 2 off. And what that does is it spreads adaptation out. So you talked about the Yerkes-Dodson law, which I love, by the way. I think that's a really powerful model. And one of the ways I would use the Yerkes-Dodson law in an adaptation sense is to think of adaptation as that process of going up the curve and then down the other side, right? So in that experiment that led to that, it was the quantity, right? The dose that led to going up, right? If you did too high a dose, you plateaued and went down, right? And the other key function is time. So if we take exercise as an example, if we walk every day for the rest of our life, we're going to pretty much spread out the Yerkes-Dodson effect over the course of decades, right? We'll be able to still keep walking when we're 70, 80. But if we run a marathon every week, we're going to crunch the Yerkes-Dodson down super small. And probably within a year, we're going to be hard pressed to perform well. So in the supplement world, those are the two things from a complex systems approach we think of: the dose and the duration.
So when you say hard to perform well after a year of running a marathon every week, in what sense? You're
going to overtrain, right? You probably get injured, you burn, so when I think of in a simple sense that Yerkes Dodds as almost an adaptational upside down U. It's an adaptational curve.
Yeah.
So when you start exercising, if you were sedentary, anything you do from an exercise point is going to improve performance for a while.
Yeah.
But if you keep doing the same thing, we know at some point you're going to plateau. You're not going to continue to, benefit from it. And if you continue to do the same exercise, then you'll eventually overtrain. Performance will start to worsen. And because of that, exercise specialists have people adjust their routines over time, right? Do different types of weight training, take time off. All of those things essentially reset that adaptation process. They spread the time component out tremendously. And so what I would say in a lot of the supplement world tends to be more is better. If 100 milligrams of this was great, a gram's got to be better, right? If 100 improve focus, geez, I want more focus than that, I'm going to do 5 times as much. But that's not how things work over time. Like maybe in a day that would happen, but if you kept doing that over time, you're going to crush down that curve. Does that make sense?
And then the brain will adapt.
Right. So you'll need more to get the same effect, but you've also your benefits over time. So one of the things that I noticed early on when I was doing research in supplements is you'd often see a supplement improve something over, say, 4 to 8 weeks, but by 6 months, it was back to only working about as well as placebo. So you'd kind of track through that curve over time.
And from your perspective, this is habituation. This is the brain learning that this new substance, whatever you're introducing to it, is now the new status quo. And so it simply adjusts through neural receptors or other mechanisms it has to reset a new norm.
Correct.
Norm.
Like what it will do. So like say right now in the anti-aging space, but also for brain, you'll see it, NAD+. So super important molecule. And something that we've known how to build, frankly, since the 40s, right? But any vitamin B3, tryptophan, all are things that can boost NAD+. So the new thing is that a different type of vitamin B3 was discovered. And so that's kind of become the sexy new thing. But what you would see is, so one of the studies it's called nicotinamide riboside, is this new niacin equivalent for your audience. So one of the human studies, they did 2 different doses over time. And I love studies where they compare multiple doses. Like to me, that's where you start to see adaptation come into play if you're looking for it. So what they found is over 4 weeks, say we'll call it the baseline dose, the low dose, boosted NAD about 40%. And the higher dose, which was double, if my memory serves me, boosted at 90. So like super cool. I want to do the double dose because like who would settle for 40 when I can have 90, right?
Of course.
Right. And so, but then they kept doing the study and remeasured things at 8 weeks. So at that point, the low dose was up to 44%. And forgive me if my numbers are like slightly off.
Yeah.
But the 90 had come down to, I think it was 55. So you'd already seen what I would think of as the beginning of that curve, right? You'd hit the peak and now you're coming down. And I think the reason is, one, we have capability to methylate and eliminate niacin equivalents. So that was, like my guess is if they had measured that, they would have seen a big uptick in our capacity to eliminate, right? Like we'd pushed it so hard, our body actually upregulated something else to get rid of some of it, right? So like I would say in this case, the lower dose was more like walking, the higher dose was more like running, maybe not a marathon every week, but it kicked in a lot more compensatory mechanisms. And my intuition is if that study had continued out to 6 months, the higher dose might not have actually worked better, right? So that's when I think of like a complex systems approach, we're always thinking, what can we anticipate in terms of the learning and the adaptation based on other mechanisms we know, often based on what's like hinted to in a study like this one. So what that would lead us to say is, okay, niacin's great, like niacin equivalents, nicotinamide riboside, the older, niacin flushing version, niacinamide, the non-flushing.
Yep.
And that doesn't mean more is better. There's probably like a Goldilocks range where we're going to get that best performance and get that best performance in a more enduring manner.
You know, I think this particular kind of principle that cuts across so many domains is so easy to overlook and so powerful once you grasp it. And it's easy to forget it, right? I mean, I'm doing, you know, I'm in the process this whole year. I'm doing what I'm calling the Deep Change Project, and I'm really trying to fundamentally rewire my own brain and then measure these different areas, right? And one of the things that I've been doing over, and I'm blocking these out in sort of 2-month chunks.
Okay.
So right now, I'm in this kind of time period of focus, right? I'm trying to increase my focus and really dial down distraction, which I think is a real problem for a lot of people. So it just, again, increasing states of flow and really thinking hard, how do I hack attention and really get good at creating habits around that? So anyway, but one of the things that I've found, I guess, surprising, but also reassuring, is that every kind of 2 months I've been building this kind of set of kind of keystone habits that I lock in and I'm really non-negotiable on. And this month, so my first 2 months, it was really a morning routine, you know,
awesome. Yeah.
reading, exercise, and meditation. And then these 2 months, it's really my afternoon routine, which is, so in the morning I do yoga, in the afternoon I do something more cardio. So it's exercise, a 20-minute nap, and playing guitar, which is something I've always just wanted to do.
Yeah.
So again, it's 3 20-minute breaks in between my kind of sprints, my 90-minute sprints. So this is a way, you know, one of the things I've thought a lot about is the way that we work doesn't really work. You know, our brain doesn't work good in marathons. It works good in sprints and breaks.
For sure. Yep.
And
it'll take them on its own if we don't take it for it. So.
That's right. You just find yourself surfing social media and you wonder why you're so distracted. It's because your brain's crying, just begging you to take a break that's actually going to restore it and not just deplete it even more, which attention rich activities usually deplete the brain more. And so what you need to do is take a break and take a walk in nature, right? But it's been interesting because one of the problems I find is that as you create the habits, the real routines around it, they're not glamorous. They're not, you know, exciting. They're not, they don't hit you over the head with the outcomes, how good they make you feel. But cumulatively, you know, I'm wearing my Aura ring right now. So I've been, you know, watching my heart rate variability and my body temperature and my resting heart rate and my breathing rate and a whole host of different factors, how much I'm sleeping and whatever. And I've watched this curve since January. Just, you know, it's not dramatic, but it is steady. And it just keeps my heart rate variability just keeps doing this. And I really do attribute it to these kind of core habits that are forcing me to do the daily. Again, I think I'm pushing myself into that sweet spot where I'm not overexerting myself, even though that out of the gate, I kind of want that high outcome. It's like if I can stay slow and steady and be really steady about it, the cumulative outcome is just amazing. And brains are we have a hard time seeing that.
Yeah. I mean, this was something I noticed in practice, both when I was in practice, but coaching other doctors as well, is patients would often tell you, oh, give me the whole plan right now. Like I'm going to like change everything this month. But like we only have, I like the metaphor of a willpower reservoir, whether that's true or not. But it seems in the real world, we do. Like in the course of a day, course of any short period of time, we've got a finite amount to draw on. And if we try to change too much too quickly, we just run that dry. And then all of a sudden we like go off the rails. All of the good things we started all of a sudden just slide off. Where if we do things more modestly, more incrementally, then we often get to keep those things. Because the way I think of it is a habit like brushing our teeth has become a ritual. For most people, it would take more willpower not to brush their teeth than to brush it. Right. And because they would feel, there'd be something right? So we want to, as much as possible, tackle only a few things and change those until they become more of a ritual. And once they become a ritual, and the kind of my intuition personally about that is once it starts to feel like, oh, this, I would miss doing this, then that's the time to start adding new things in. So, I mean, there's no magic formula, but in general, your approach is the approach that works because you don't see the crash and burn where people, you know, like that's the tortoise and the hare analogy, going out of the gate super fast doesn't always win the race.
Yeah, it's a long game, short game thing. And I do find that no matter, you know, I do a lot of, I do a lot of this science communicating myself. I'm speaking a lot in training a lot. And I speak specifically about this topic a lot. And I do find that it is a hard one for people to grasp because the promise of immediate reward looms so powerful. It looms so powerful that you have to, in some ways, outsmart. You know, it's, I don't know if it's our nucleus accumbens or what part of our kind of pleasure-seeking brain is kind of wanting that instant gratification now. But if you can kind of hear that part of your brain, thank it for desiring the instant gratification now, and then still play the long game and push through the monotony of the kind of day-to-day kind of boringness of it, or even kind of pain of it sometimes. By the time it does become a habit, it's pretty pleasurable. It's easy, as you said, right? It's like, how could I not do this? I mean, I've been wanting to take an afternoon nap now for over a year. And until I basically said, okay, non-negotiable, I have to take a nap. And I've got an accountability partner. And I text every day saying I've done my, you know, like I've put teeth in the commitment.
Yep.
Now I'm like, oh my gosh, how do people not take naps in the afternoon? You know, now it's like a no-brainer. Same thing with yoga in the morning. I'm like, how do people survive without doing yoga first? You know, and again, obviously these are my personal experiences. I don't mean to generalize, but it is surprising. You have to get through that middle part in order to come out the other end and go and look back with kind of the kind of wisdom of hindsight and go, oh, that really was the better approach all along.
Yeah. Yeah. And I, like, similar to you, my morning is, I would say, the most important part of my, like, a daily ritual, for lack of a better way to describe it. I did a podcast yesterday, actually. And one of the things that the host mentioned, that part of his morning is before he gets out of bed, in that beginning waking period, once he becomes fully conscious, he always says, I love my life. That's like that's a non-negotiable part. And I'm like, oh, that's super cool. That's easy. And I did that today. It made me feel good. Right. So, you know, but part of my morning ritual, it's definitely when I do my best with exercise. So most mornings, that's my immediate thing. I'll take my nootropic stack, go to the gym. And then after that, I live in San Diego, so pretty much all year I can sit outside after the gym, and that's when I'll have my coffee and, you know, get my morning light, and then have a decent breakfast after that. And that sets the table for the rest of the day. So one of the things, if we go back to sleep, one of the things with sleep is people often are trying to fix sleep when sleep's not working at night. But a lot of sleep at night is going to be dictated by what we did first thing in the day because of our body clock, right? Because if we get a good spike of cortisol then, which is what we should be having, and do a lot of things like the morning sunlight, getting instead of an all starchy breakfast, getting some modest amount of protein, all those things tend to make it so the ripple effect at the end of the day is we sleep better. So oftentimes people, like, there's a saying in, there's a type of chiropractic called applied kinesiology, and they deal historically a lot with pain, but the saying was, where it is, it ain't. So where you're feeling the pain isn't where the problem is, right? Some other muscles may be weak, that's causing a different muscle to work too much, that's now causing toxic buildup that we're thinking of as inflammation and pain. But just working on that local area is not going to fix the problem. So you see that with health. Like, people with sleep will focus inordinately on that time period right around bedtime. But the truth is, there's really powerful things you could have done early in the day that might have had a bigger impact.
Yeah, I love this idea. You know, it's surprising how much science matters on this stuff because it really gives us insight into where our intuition gets it wrong. Um, but exercise and getting sunlight in the morning, I do find as well, if I haven't had a kind of vigorous exercise kind of, you know, whatever, if I've taken it a lot milder that day, I don't sleep as deeply. It's actually my deep sleep
Yep.
that seems to get short shrift. So tell us more. I know you're kind of an expert on the the timing of, you know, biological rhythms and how those sync up with light rhythms. So
Yeah.
talk to us about optimizing or thinking a better way to think about those and how to get
Yes.
those
So
going.
I would tend to use the term naturalistic light. So if we think of light early in the day, you'll notice like blue skies as an example, right? Lots of blue early in the day.
Yeah.
At sunset, you're going to see a lot more oranges, yellows, reds. So light has, as we would see in science experiments as a kid with a prism, it's a rainbow of colors. So what science has found increasingly over time is that blue light color from sunlight, but from any light source early in the day, is really a great thing to boost what I think of as our arousal, our wakefulness brain chemistry.
Yeah.
But blue light at night is, since it's arousing, is the worst thing for us because it interferes with melatonin, which is kind of our timing hormone for darkness.
Yeah.
And so countering blue light at night. So I think since maybe 12, 14 years ago, I have these orange goggles I wear if I'm going to watch TV at night, right?
Yeah.
And those orange lenses block out blue frequencies. But what I think of as naturalistic lighting, so candles, a fireplace, those things at night would be more naturalistic. They're not going to be as stimulating. A TV monitor, a computer monitor, our smartphone, reading, you know, a Kindle or something that's emitting blue light, that's going to be an alerting signal for our brain, which makes it really difficult to, one, get as deep in sleep, but also it subdues the amount of melatonin we create. And these hormones that have narrow windows where they spike in our blood act as timekeeping things. And I guess the way I would say it in a simple sense is they do all their job in a really narrow point in time. But if we decrease the amplitude of the wave, basically it's not as big a surge, and spread it out, now their job is bleeding into other jobs. And the result is no one's job is getting done particularly well. So what we want to do always when you think of circadian rhythms, body clock function, you want the right thing at the right time. And light just happens to be one of the cues that we evolved, well, I say light and darkness, to make sure that jobs get done at the right time.
Yeah, it's interesting. Again, and I do think people, you know, again, I when it comes to sleep, I find that what people will often try to do is if they're restless in their bed, for example, they'll there's like these layers of not getting quite as far as what you're suggesting, right? First, they'll try to just calm down and breathe, or they'll ruminate about not sleeping and kind of beat themselves up for it, which of course arouses and gets them more upset and makes them not sleep. Pairing that state with the bed itself, and the brain starts believing that it's supposed to be in that state when it's in the bed, which is, again, you know, that kind of classical conditioning linking that the brain tends to do, which trips us up, right? But most people, and then sometimes people will get out of bed if they have insomnia or something and maybe read, which is one of the better things to do in low light, if you're to leave the bed itself. But again, not many people are thinking, get out of the door in the first thing in the morning, get sun on my actual skin.
Yeah, I mean, and I think the most important thing is the interaction with the eyes. And it doesn't have to be a lot.
Oh,
it's not like, you know, you need to go for a half-hour run, just, you know, getting outside for 10 minutes. And so for me, that's I usually am closer to a half hour, 40 minutes having my coffee, but I'm, you know, always sit outside at one of the coffee shops here locally when I do it. And you know, the other thing, we wouldn't want to have sunglasses on then, or and if we can't do that, then we want to sit as close by windows in the morning at work as our circumstances allow. We want to get essentially the more we get morning light exposure, the more likely like our body clock rhythm will function well over the course of the whole day, even if things might disrupt it later.
Fascinating.
So anyways, the beginning of the day ends up being a super important time. The wind down before bed, super important as well. Those are almost the transition periods, and transitions in life and in our day seem to just outweigh other times in terms of their overall importance.
Yeah. So if you're struggling with sleep, focus on the two transition, the getting up transition, and the going to bed transition, and make sure that you're.
And then the other thing with, you mentioned like some people wake up, it's completely normal to wake up periodically once in a, like for me, I would say I have always not been a person that struggles with sleep, but every once in a while I have a night that for some reason I'll be wide awake at 2 for no reason that I can, figure out. I didn't do anything differently. Yeah. And I just roll with it. I know one of my core beliefs is trust my body, that it'll figure it out. Like my job is to give it the best support possible. It'll do its best to do the rest. And so, I'll usually check in, kind of do self-talk. Is there anything that you need? Was there something that I did to disrupt it? If I have a lot on my mind, it's often as simple as just writing it down. It's almost like my brain wants to make sure I don't forget it.
Yeah.
And so as soon as it's convinced, like it's not going to be forgotten, it's like, all right, we're good. We can go back to sleep now. So
go ahead. No, finish.
I just think that that idea of checking in for me over time has been super important. And every once in a while, so I don't know if this story would resonate with you, but I've never had allergies. So right after naturopathic school, I moved to Sandpoint, Idaho to work for a vitamin company up there called Thorne Research this was, say 96. And ended up finding at one of the thrift stores, there's this cool old Army Navy surplus sleeping bag. So I'm like, this rocks, I'm going to use it, right? Because it was down and I had like a really nice North Face sleeping bag. But I'm like, I'm going to use this one, right? So this is probably mid-October. I go camping, froze all night, right?
Wow.
There was pockets in it that the down wasn't spread evenly, right?
Oh, shoot.
Right? So that next morning I woke up, I had just horrible allergies.
Oh, interesting.
So, I'm a naturopath. So I did, herbal things, nutrients, like everything I could think of for allergies. 2 days later, still really bad. So I'm lying down to go to bed that night. And I'm like, body, I don't really know what's going on, but some part of you might. And, I want to help you do what you need me to do. So any insight you could give me about, why you think having these allergies is important, please do. And about, a minute or two later, this idea pops into my head. I don't want you to be cold again. And I'm like, cool, that rocks. I don't want to be cold again. How about I don't use that sleeping bag next time I camp? And I'm like, oh, that'll work. And I literally felt like almost this line go down with the allergies just melting away.
Fascinating.
Right. So I would say that's more the zebra than the horses. There's this saying in medicine, when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. But I've both with patients and personally had experiences where it's almost this flash of insight when you do allow, I guess, the opportunity for that communication. And not to say it's going to solve everything, but quite often my experience has been almost uniformly our body, our brain are learning and adapting and trying to do the best they know how. Quite often what they get stuck in or what they choose for a strategy wouldn't be what we would choose. But when you think about it, the reason behind the strategy, like that rocks. I would want you to do that. Let's just think of a better way to accomplish that.
I love that idea of your body as like a partnership. You're in partnership, or you're in your higher level cognitive processing, right? Our language centers, their sort of executive function, the ones that we think of it as our whole brain, even though it's a very, very small part of our kind of what's going on in the system, in relationship to this kind of more visceral, embodied cognition, right? Where our body speaks to, again, this sort of very, I don't know, it's like I just think of it as cognitive or sort of thinking part of the brain, right? And that those two can kind of have this nice because the thinking part of the brain, it's not that it's useless, it's one that makes the plans.
Right.
So they can think about the future. It's the one that can sort of see it all and analyze it better. But it's not necessarily having that depth of embodied insight and so learning to trust our bodies. And I think even with supplementation, as if people are experimenting with nootropics or other types of things, whether it's amount you're taking or other things, learning to trust your N of one, right? Your individual body, I think is really powerful.
For sure. There's in the nootropic community, there's a acronym, your mileage may vary, but it's YMMV. And the idea is that the same nootropic compound or stack might work completely different for you, your N of one, than me. And so it's super important for people to do the self-experimentation. And so, sometimes I'll be asked by people at a trade show, well, what about this other nootropic stack? What are your thoughts? Like, did it work for you? Right? Like, I'm not going to presume to know what's going to work best for you. I want you to experiment, see how you subjectively feel. Even better if you can do things like the Aura Ring and get some objective data as well, and then use that feedback to dial in what's going to work best for you. And the second part, which to me is as important, don't get locked into just because that worked today or this month, that it's going to keep working for a year or a decade. What I saw early on in naturopathic school was this strong tendency to get what I would say attached to the tool, the thing. So like you see it a lot with diet, like I'm a paleo, I'm a keto, I'm a vegan, right? Like all good things. But the truth is, and I'll step back, I had this great nutrition teacher when I was in school. And one of the big things that I remember him saying was, there can be a big difference between a diet that takes someone that's on a horrible diet and gets them healthy and a diet that keeps them healthy. So don't get locked into what moved you. Like, always be flexible and focus on where you want to stay. Like, what's the focus, I would say, on the goal. So what I was a vegetarian my last year in the Navy, and then for about another 5 years after that. And at one point I just found, for me, it was super hard to maintain muscle mass. My hands were cold a lot. There was like low level things that I just wasn't satisfied with, that got better when I reintroduced some lamb and fish. So not to say that would be something that every vegetarian should do, but although I did pretty well on it, and it definitely got me from being less healthy to more healthy, it wasn't keeping me as healthy as I wanted. And so I think it's like, to me, a super important thing is to focus on the result and be flexible about the things we do to get there and stay there. So I like you mentioned meditation, yoga. I taught yoga in the 90s. One of the older yoga teachers I used to see at, it was called Sanssouci Beach in Waikiki. He used to be there at sunset a lot. And my recollection is he had taught Kareem Abdul-Jabbar yoga back, in the 70s. Like, when no one did yoga, he did yoga.
He was doing it, yeah.
And what he said is that every year he took 2 weeks off and did basically a fast from his life. He stopped doing yoga. He didn't meditate. Wasn't a vegetarian. Like, he basically said, Greg, this is it for me. Like, I started yoga to be flexible. And if I become so inflexible, I can't give up yoga for 2 weeks, I've somehow lost track of what I was, going about this for. So for me, that idea of being flexible, not getting rigidly locked into that, oh, I did keto, I remember feeling great on it for like a couple months, this is the diet for me for the rest of my life, it wouldn't be how I would approach it. I would like, great, we got this thing that we know did this. Is it still doing this? And if it's not, then time to adjust. Don't throw it out. You may still want to cycle keto back in maybe next winter. So I just am a huge fan of anything that you do more intermittently. So cycle this in, do it for a while, then kind of go on a fast for it and shift into some other thing. And what I think is, just like exercise, that's going to help our brain work the best, right? It's going to force it, because change is how our senses are designed. Do you know, have you ever encountered, I think it's called the Hooks-Weber law?
I'm not sure if I know that.
So I think of it like the Yerkes-Dodson law is like one of these super great mental models. So and I might have the name wrong. But the idea, it goes back to vision. And so what we know is if your room was completely dark and I brought a candle in, you would notice a big difference. But if we already had 100 candles in your room and brought one more in, not so much, right? So the quantity, the one candle wasn't what was important. It was the relative change. So the Hooks-Weber law is about our vision and hearing, but it's why those systems like hearing is in decibels, a log system, because it's the proportional change that matters. And what we find with any sense, and you mentioned habituation earlier, that our brain is designed to habituate, right? So, and also designed to discriminate based on change, because that's what matters for survival, right? So if we've got a low level sound in the background, our nervous system will do its best to move that from our awareness. But if now there's a big change in noise, we'll notice that. So anyways, like for me, just like with Yerkes Dodson law and adaptation, I'm always thinking of this proportional change. How can I create more change, but in a healthy way? So have you ever talked about like hot and cold water applications for health on your show?
No.
Okay, so
No,
it's
not yet.
I mean, you'll see like like biohackers use like cryotherapy, ice baths, things like that. You'll see other people use saunas, but I would be wired to just like with my morning shower routine, take a hot shower, turn the hot all the way off, cold as much as it can go for 30 seconds. That creates change, right? A big contrast, and do that 2 or 3 times. And now in a simple, small crunch down time window, you're doing something that's actually very invigorating. Even here in San Diego, where we don't get super cold water, you can create a lot of contrast, a lot of change, and it's the change where the magic happens.
I love that.
So you don't have to do an incredible ice bath or super hot sauna. You can do things that produce what I would say similar types of responses by just using contrast and change.
I love that. I love that. I have to come back to the empathy stack because I know listeners are so curious about that piece of the different cognitive dimensions. Because again, it is intuitive. It would be attention and memory and these others. So I want to ask you about that as we wrap up. I want to ask you about the empathy piece of what you guys are working on. And then the last question I want to ask is about what you guys are doing with longevity. I know you're working on a new product. So in that order,
sure.
Empathy.
So empathy. So I mean, really, it was the latter. The Ternes is the anti-aging product, and it just launched April 16th. So that was yesterday as we're doing this live.
I love it.
And we talked earlier in the show about the NAD molecule, and there's a couple different ways to build it. So the in complexity science, there's an idea of redundancy, right? More than one way to do something. And so we see that with making NAD. We can make it from tryptophan, an amino acid, and basically that's called from scratch. We literally build that molecule from a different molecule. We can make it through the flushing niacin, that's called the Price Handler pathway, and we can do it from a pathway called salvage, which is where nicotinamide riboside, niacinamide, the old niacin, fills in. So we've got these 3 ways to make it. So when we built the anti-aging product, we wanted to support all 3, because for us, if the body's doing something with redundancy, it makes more sense to support that rather than just hammering one of those routes really hard in a high dose. So when I was researching tryptophan, I started to come up with these studies showing, like one of them, people that took a modest dose of tryptophan showed more altruistic behaviors. In another one, they selected more happy faces in this online cognitive assessment. And so that got me thinking, wow, there's, that would be a nice core of an empathy stack, right? And so that started our pursuit to see if there's other things we can identify that would have, happiness, empathy type of qualities to them. So we're at this point early on in the process. I've been putting together essentially the menu of things I think might work. And then our process after that is we'll essentially create a recipe, test it internally. And then if we're starting to feel like, our iterations of that recipe are starting to look like, hey, we're getting consistent response, then we'll do a bigger batch and test it in our community. Usually we do 50 to 100 people that will send things out and then start to gather their feedback. So we're super early, but it's one that would be something I'd be excited to add in to augment what Qualia does.
Yeah, so it's funny. So in May and June, I'm working on positive emotion, on increasing states of happiness, and so yeah. So if you need any guinea pigs, I'm happy to, because I love that idea of in some sense, I've been fascinated by this idea of reversing the brain's kind of built-in negativity bias, which is what psychologists call our tendency to focus on what's wrong instead of what's right in our lives. And again, I do find when I'm putting myself continually in those states of on a neurochemical level, I assume things like my oxytocin are a little bit higher, things like my serotonin and maybe my endorphins and other things, but it's not necessarily my default. I've got to work to get there. And so I love the idea of sort of helping our brains create a new default or kind of shifting. And in some sense, right, as I look at my own kind of journey this year, this is what I'm trying to kind of experiment with is, can you set new defaults? Can you take yourself as a 1.0 version of you and really upgrade that to a 2.0 version of you and actually create, again, I don't think anything's really permanent because the body and mind are always in change, but at least stability, or sort of that you're coming from that place of happiness or again, connection. I love that it's empathy, because I think a lot of the times, if you go to any conference and watch the way people socialize with each other, we're all in our own heads. We're worried about what they think of us, and to get out of our own heads and into relationship, into the moment, I find to be a really powerful idea that, of course, we're all seeking after. But again, it's sort of how do we keep nudging ourselves in that direction?
Yeah, and I think, like, I often think when there's something we're not good at, we need a couple things to get better. Like usually we need like some type of resources, whether they're learning resources, you name it. We also need feedback, right? Like, so if we've got, if we get better resources and we get better feedback, we'll often get improvement in performance in almost any area. And a lot of the way I think of like something like tryptophan, choline, these building blocks of neurotransmitters, is they're a resource. And quite often what we find in populations, they're not getting enough of that resource. And
just
so
straight up the raw ingredients.
The raw ingredient, and that you don't have to do, so again, not more is better, but augmenting the pool, so to speak, so that you'd bring what the average person gets up to a level that's going to allow better performance. And then taking the whole systems approach, so oxytocin, that would be, I've looked, there's not much in terms of natural compounds that's been studied for oxytocin yet. But again, my intuition would be if certain things would, if they'd been studied. So, same with the serotonin system. So what, sometimes when you're putting formulations together, there's some guesswork, right? You'd love more information. And sometimes that's why it becomes important to do the recipe, iterating the recipe multiple times till you dial in something that produces the type of subjective and measurable response you want.
Yeah.
So, I think empathy, I don't know about you, but I've got, my personal experience is like empathy is almost like a muscle. Some people have super developed empathy. Some people it's like, geez, did you get any of this software at all?
Yeah.
And so it's one of those old things. And I think people that do sales, empathy might not be as great a tool for them. For like a holistic doctor, a counselor, in romantic relationship, empathy is obviously super important. So oftentimes what you see with the brain is, and I guess the analogy, I remember, 20 years ago, and I don't remember the book it was in, but there was a chapter on this person that at the time was thought of as having the best memory on record. And I don't remember the details, But when I read it, there was certain things that he couldn't do that you and I would take for granted, because to do them requires just a little bit of forgetting. And he couldn't do that little bit, right? So sometimes like more in one area brings some unforeseen weaknesses. So to me, my personal goal is to have like the just right amount of stuff, and to be able to dial up certain things as I need more of them. So
I love it. Well, for those who are listening, no matter what your interest is, the team at Neurohacker Collective, including Dr. Kelly, are, in my opinion, are getting it really right. I just think you guys have the sort of links, I think, to which you're going to really get the balance of these things right. Again, these are complex, interconnected relationships when you're working with nootropics or any form of supplementation. I've had really positive experiences with Qualia. It sounds like a Ternes just came out. So this is about anti-aging and longevity and those who are interested in that. And then the empathy is in the works, sounds like.
Down the road, I think the roadmap, and again, we wouldn't introduce a product unless we felt like like one of our things is there's enough noise in the world. We don't want to add more noise. We want more signal. So unless we can create a product that in our testing shows that it makes a difference, we wouldn't launch it. But near term, we're in the midst of, right now, the test phase of a nootropic shot. So that one, this week, I think yesterday, we're sending it out to our, I think it was a 50 to 70 person test audience. And then after that, sleep is the highest priority. I've been working on that since August. And we're about, and sleep is great because so many people now have Oura rings or other things that allow you to get great data, we'll know if it works or not, right? So like it'll give us, we might have to make multiple variances of this formulation before we get one that we're satisfied with. And it's possible we'll never get there. But if sleep's the next thing that we're about to move into the testing phase. And then after that, empathy and a few other things are all competing for attention. So it will be more of a team decision, what we think would be the next thing to move forward. But empathy is in the short list of 5.
Love it. Love it. Tell us where we can find you. How do people find Neurohacker Collective?
Sure. So our website is just neurohacker.com. We've got Facebook. I think I don't know how Facebook works, but you can link to it from our website. Same with Instagram. And we do, especially in the social media, where we constantly are doing things to connect with our community. And I would say the vast majority aren't related to buy Qualia or buy Ternes. They're like, try these, life hacks, or I do a monthly neurohacking in the news where any of the science articles I've seen that lend themselves to a real world application. I'll review those. Sometimes we do a show and tell. So we had the blue blocking glasses, showing in our last one, because we were covering a study that had just shown like blue light at night. It was an animal study, but basically animals that they induced essentially cardiac arrest, heart attacks. They did much more poorly when they were exposed to dim light conditions instead of darkness, but giving essentially red light instead of low level dim light, it essentially worked as well as the darkness. So when I see studies like that, like over the course of the month, I pull them out and then we do an Instagram conversation about, all right, this is kind of what's new in neuroscience or life hacking, and this is what you might consider trying in your life. So our social media is more focused on those things.
I love it. Yeah. And I've seen your blog. If you're interested in not just supplementation, but just kind of neurohacking or brain hacking in general, what's kind of the latest in the science around this? I know you guys are producing a lot of good content.
Thank you.
For that as well. So thank you again, Dr. Kelly, so much for being on the show. It's been such a pleasure to have you on. And I look forward very much to a continued conversation.
Fantastic. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.